Okay, so like I said, I spent a year plus with kind of a roller coaster ride with Arduino.org, and so I have a little bit of visibility behind the scenes, and I wanted to share some of that with you. Right now, I'm just an independent biz tech advisor, and I get to work with who I want to work with and do the fun projects, promote the really good projects that I see out there on the hardware and the software side. And really, the reason I don't know a lot of you already is because I do come from the software side more or less on the open source software. I'm an electrical engineer, but I spent a lot of time kernel upstreaming and stuff before I was introduced to microcontrollers. Not myself upstreaming, but coordinating those projects. So I wanted to start out with some history. Back in 2004, Hernando Barragan wrote his master's thesis on a project he called Wiring. And how many of you heard that, the Wiring project? Yeah, I expected this community to know that story pretty well. So the first 25 boards he actually soldered by hand himself for the boards that he made. And then Gianluca Martino, who was at one of the local manufacturing companies, IDII, the Institute for Design, hired out to get these first 100 boards made that they used in a class, and it turned out to be highly successful. Remember, this was the era in which microcontrollers, what Hernando did that was so cool is made microcontrollers accessible to artists and designers, where at the time it was just too much work to figure out how to even write, the 20 lines of code that it took to program a GPIO. And he wanted them to experiment with light and sound and actions and make it more easy. One of his thesis advisors was Massimo Banzi, and he got together with some other people, and they started developing in 2005. Then when the IDII shut down, formed a group to produce, Gianluca Martino redesigned the wiring board and made the first Arduino version. And they took the wiring software and just applied that software to the same board. And over the span of that time, then those five worked together and made Arduino really a huge success, if you think about it, the whole marketing, the push into the education side of things. But around 2008, some trademark jockeying, there was some disgruntled between Gianluca Martino and Massimo. I won't go into those details. But in the meantime, Hernando Barragan had gone back to Colombia in Bogota, where he is currently the Dean of Architecture and Design Institute in Bogota, and he continued wiring, and he started working with some other developers. So wiring and Arduino continued, even though marketing-wise, Arduino was the real success story in showing the wiring framework to the rest of the world in a very big way. Then I met Federico Musto when I was at Qualcomm Atheros on the Wi-Fi router chip team, product manager, and he had started a company that did the equivalent of the Arduino Yun. It combined a Linux processing chip that had Wi-Fi with a microcontroller on the same board. He then coordinated with Gianluca Martino, bought him out, and basically began participating in one half of the trademark battle, because the trademark battle was between Gianluca, who did all the manufacturing, and Massimo and the others who hadn't been doing the manufacturing. So Federico took over that manufacturing side because he wanted the brand. Then Federico got a hold of Hernando and convinced Hernando to write the history of Arduino, because they were fighting in court, and there was big money on the table to own the trademark. So Federico convinced Hernando to write this Untold History, which, if you haven't read, is a really good read. And that made the court cases start going toward the SRL, the smart products side of things, because Gianluca Martino had filed a trademark first. And then there was a big handshake about a year ago at New York Maker Faire that culminated in a settlement in January of this year, where they settled on were bringing these two together, and it was kind of a weird design where the holding company owned the trademarks all in one company, and there was 3 boards of directors, but the holding company was owned by 2 different groups, and Federico had half, and Massimo and the others had half, and so even though they were, they co-owned the trademarks, there was essentially 2 licensed manufacturers, and they were both still making competing products, if you will. And so there was still some angst and a lot of uneasiness behind the scenes. But in that January settlement, they had already set the terms that within 6 months, either side could buy out the other, if they could pony up the money, because the terms, the big bucks that you had to buy out the other side was not insignificant. And up until today, it was a mystery of how Fabio Violante, what connections he had, or Massimo, who had the connections into the big money that allowed them to buy out the other half. But if you haven't seen the blog this morning, it turns out this is new to my slide as of today, it was ARM helped back this transition. So, so here's my history. The end part of my slide really is the part that worries me is that there's a little bit of an industry bias I've seen toward getting involved with the Arduino as a trademark. And really, I don't think we should all be worrying about a trademark so much as we should be worrying about open source software and open source hardware. And anything that hinders this community to promote these innovations is not necessarily a good thing. So we have to put a little pressure on that. And even though I've talked to Massimo about collaborating, the Orange site went live this morning also, which is basically, hey, we need to curate this framework between the hardware cores and the sketch space, the user space, and we need the whole industry behind it, and we need everyone to participate and to benefit from it, and you can't be biasing it in any way. So I'll talk a little bit about Orange being a reboot of the wiring project to make sure, and Hernando is 100% behind this, so that we make sure that there's a good, strong moving forward path and bring it forward. So again, I told you that my background was more from seeing this from a Linux kernel side, where you've got chip hardware, you've got a whole bunch of kernel drivers and modules to connect that hardware to a common user space. And yeah, there are some companies that avoid the common user space and go around it, but more or less, you can program your code in user space, and if you need file storage, and if you need Wi-Fi connections or something like that, you can connect and see the layers or audio or something. You don't have to know what hardware is underneath the covers. Same thing with wiring an Arduino framework is I should be able to pick up a development board, and I don't care if it's an ST or a NXP or a microchip, Atmel, somebody's microcontroller. It's great if I can write the same code and the same sketch, and I can make things happen, and I can use different boards. So the real core thing is that this wiring framework API, we want that common, and any chip vendor, we want to push the chip vendors to say, hey, make a core library that connects up to your chip so that anyone can use that chip in their education, in their designs, and their IoT. And will more hardware designs be opened up? I see yes. I mean, I see Hologram opening up their designs. With the RISC-V architecture and Sci-5, you see them opening up designs. And I've seen the Qualcomm, I've seen the industry side, and they're going to take a lot of pushing to come around. But if everybody else is doing it, I think it will happen. And even if people worry about the increased competition of open hardware, but you all know that it's really the copyright and the brand and the trademark that's the real powerful part. And you see that with the open source 3D printers or whatever it is. So you gain your loyal customers, and your distributors recognize that brand, and they can promote that brand. It makes them easier for them to sell. And my favorite quote in this idea is, a rising tide floats all boats. So the whole market gets bigger, your slice of the pie grows with it, even if there's more competition in that market. So how many of you are satisfied today with the Arduino software support for open hardware? I can say I'm not, just because if these are my two options, the first one, when I pick up a non-Arduino board, I have to go into the profile, the preferences settings, and I have to put these funky little JSON URLs in there. And when I'm teaching 7th graders, this is not an intuitive step. I'm sorry, it's just not. And so if you pick something, quote unquote, third party, why should we have to do that? And then I went and tried to use Arduino Create for a project, and it turns out that, again, the board list is even more limited. You can only use, for some reason my slides don't fit, but there's a small list of boards, even smaller list. So what I think the Orange Foundation should do is make sure that we can endorse and show off, hey, here's a whole bunch of unbiased software options, and here's some of my favorites, and I welcome your input on the other ones. And this is actually what the foundation should do, is say, hey, that wiring framework that connects up all these chips into all these actions or sensing, if you haven't used Snap for Arduino or Snap, one of my absolute favorites. Using this with kids, it's so intuitive, it's fantastic. Platform IO is what I use kind of on a day-to-day basis, and what I am here to represent Ivan Kravitz, who's a developer in the Ukraine, and he does Platform IO. Fantastic project. Supports not only the Arduino wiring framework, but Embed and the chipset vendor's own framework, so you can get going. And over 400 boards, it's great. Apache Minute doesn't support the wiring framework yet, but it's a really good, completely open source Apache Software Foundation project for 32-bit micros. And then Embed Xcode is, again, Olivier, a guy in France who literally does Embed Xcode as a hobby, but he's done it with all make files and stuff. So those are some of my favorites. And like I say, today I announced with better hardware, why aren't we improving the framework? So what Orange is intended to do, and you can go to orange.org to see this, is let's move beyond just setting pins and say, what about LED on-off? What about temperature, range? Get the sensors and components to make the software even easier to write. So your job is to go check out this site and decide if you want to be involved and sign up on the mailing list, because it's really you that will make this foundation happen. And I'm going to be pushing hard on the chipset vendor side to collaborate around this. So that's thank you number one. But like I said at the beginning, I'm doing a whole bunch of dabbling in a whole bunch of things, and I wanted to show you some of the educational projects and a few more screenshots since I have like a few minutes left. So UCSD, UC San Diego, Project in a Box. They're launching this and going gangbusters. I love what they're doing. One of their kits is an IoT kit. They're doing fabulous work and probably going to work through like CrowdSupply or DigiKey to actually bundle up these kits in packages so that all sorts of other schools, and they're working on kits for high school, mentoring. Here's some of the projects that they have built already, and they use these already in the university curriculum, and they want to push it down to K-12. Fabulous work this university is doing. Locally, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've teamed up with Bob Martin from Microchip, formerly Atmel, and a professor at San Jose State in De Anza, and we're using all her college students to build a design that was basically a shield on top of an Arduino Nano, and we are teaching this now to 7th graders, some high schools, and essentially the kids get to build a bauble, and these baubles are going to be on display from November to January at Christmas in the Park in San Jose. And we specifically selected schools in East San Jose where the kids are like 95% are on free or reduced lunch. This is the first programming or electronics these kids have ever done, and it's not taught in their schools at all. So this is a great project, and we're putting together a kit, so that high schools, they can actually solder, just like you're doing over there, their own shield, because there's just header pins, a resistor, and LED strips that have cut in shapes of, in length of 232. Then I met this wonderful superintendent in Michigan, Detroit, and he's working with educators, and they're building an opportunity kit, which I love this idea. They don't have the knowledge of putting together things from scratch, but they're essentially trying out and test marketing all sorts of products out there, and then they want to put together a whole big kit and fund schools to do the opportunity kit. Platform IO right now is really professional makers, but I just wanted to show you the the most recent Platform.io screenshot that you can see it can be, Platform.io separates the core builder from the user space, so you can make your own user interface on top of it. And so I'm going to push Platform.io to also make an educational interface, because the complexity comes when built into VS Code. With VS Code, I get full debugging and unit testing and everything. It's fantastic under the covers, so you can really go a lot deeper. Like I said, Snap, two potentiometers connected to an Arduino, and suddenly you have Etch-a-Sketch on your screen in real time. And this is even more blocks than you need. You really only need those 2 forever loops down there. Fantastic project. Fair Air, it's this group that, this is the ethanol fuel cell, and they want to reuse the patents long over the Citroën Deux Chevaux and rebuild cars and make simplified parts and make it open to the world so that developing countries can do this. And the last thing, Mozilla Gateway Project. So there's my thank you again. And if you want a sticker of Platform.io, I don't have enough for all of you, but I have about 20 or so if you want one. Thanks.